Lesson 4.2, Good versus Bad Food, How Do We Tell? The goals of this lesson are to familiarize students with types of studies in nutrition research and to make students more comfortable reading and evaluating scientific research. At the end of this lesson, students should be able to describe the main types of nutritional studies, compare and contrast the limitations of each study type, and identify bias and confounding variables. We'll achieve these goals by having a Socratic discussion and lecture with the students. To prepare for this lesson, you will need to review the key scientific concepts that will be presented throughout the lesson. These include types of scientific studies, including cell culture studies, animal models, human observational studies, human trials, and meta-analyses, and the common types of bias and confounding variables. You can review this content in the background reading provided for you in the teacher primer, the teacher manual, and the student workbook. The teacher primer provides in-depth knowledge about the scientific content presented in this lesson. The teacher manual or lesson plan provides a minute-by-minute explanation of the lesson structure, including instructions on how to manage the discussion and the activity. And the student workbook provides additional explanations for students. The key point of this lesson's do now is that there are many types of studies that can be used to answer research questions. We'll get there by having a brief Socratic discussion with the students. You can use the do now to review the content presented at the end of lesson 4.1, which shows an overview of study types that will be discussed in this lesson. The key points of this lesson's activity are that each type of study has its own strengths and limitations, and that certain types of bias are impossible to prevent when designing a study. The trick is acknowledging and accounting for that bias. We'll get there by engaging students in a Socratic discussion and by giving a short lecture. This discussion starts out by having students think of caveats of cell culture, animal, and human level studies. We will then go into more detail about each type of study presented on slide 5. This lesson also goes into more detail about observational and experimental studies, which we initially saw in lesson 4.1. Observational study types included our case series, migrant studies, cohort studies, and case control studies. We also go over randomized control studies and double-blind studies, which are interventional studies. The meta-analysis is the preferred type of study when making nutrition recommendations. They explore whether there is consensus in the field about certain topics by combining and analyzing results from multiple studies. Dietary recommendations are sometimes made before meta-analyses are performed, which could be why recommendations often change. After talking about the strengths and limitations of each study type, the discussion then goes over types of bias, including selection bias, confounding bias, and information bias. The key points of this lesson's wrap-up are that even if a scientific study cannot prove causation, it is still a valuable study, and that dietary advice shifts because many times recommendations are made from a single inconclusive study before waiting for a meta-analysis to be conducted. We'll get there by having a short discussion with the students. By the end of the lesson, students should see that dietary recommendations are sometimes made before several human studies have sufficient results to make those recommendations. When faced with a new dietary advice, the best strategy is to have an open mind, but be aware of limitations to the studies used to make those recommendations. The key points of this lesson's homework are that each type of study has its own strengths and limitations, and that certain types of bias are impossible to prevent when designing a study. The trick is acknowledging and accounting for that bias. We'll get there by having students design a study to answer one of the research questions that they formed in lesson 4.1. Students should include in their study design the population they would study and the types of bias they would expect and how they would account for them. If you did not complete lesson 4.1 with your students, they will first need to form a research question. Caution: you may want to review and approve of the student's research question before assigning them this homework, since not all questions make good research questions. This lesson can be a bit dry if given as peer lecture, so be sure to ask students a lot of questions as you go through the discussion. A great way to keep students engaged is to have students come up with a research question as a class and design different types of studies as you present them. For example, your students could try to answer, does carrots improve vision? Or, is eating cholesterol associated with heart disease? By talking about how they would design a cell culture study, an animal study, a human observational study, and a human interventional study to answer these research questions, you will keep your students engaged. By the end of this lesson, students should be able to describe the main types of nutritional studies, compare and contrast the limitations of each type of study, and identify bias and confounding variables. Students will use the knowledge of how to design a study to evaluate data from real scientific studies in Lesson 4.3. Knowing how to evaluate a study is an important scientific skill, and students will apply this skill when evaluating a diet or nutrition claim in the final project of Unit 5. Don't forget that if you have any questions, concerns, or feedback, to let us know. You can contact any of the CTSE team members and we'll be happy to help you.